You have 2 seconds to name these two countries.
So, this will be a video from Oversimplified again. This will be the football mini wars part 2. So yeah, let me just go back to start because I'm rubbish at this sort of stuff.
You have 2 seconds to name these two countries.
Honduras and El Salvador.
You're wrong, unless you got it right. Then good job. They are, of course, Honduras and El Salvador.
Yep.
One thing these two countries have
Football.
in common is being fanatic about football.
Just
Or
like
if you're
the
a
UK.
freedom-loving patriot, soccer. But do they love it so much they would go...
So, here's the reason why America calls football soccer. It's because it's a shortened version of association football, which it was originally called.
A war over it? You bet they would.
Yeah.
And that is no bueno.
Spanish, because they are two Spanish-speaking countries.
If you look at these two countries, you might notice one major difference.
One
and that
smaller
is that
than the
this
other.
one is a lot bigger than this one. However, this one had a larger population than this one, made up mostly of farmers, and there wasn't enough land for them to live and work on. So they started moving...
Yeah, so this is actually still a big problem to this day, that there's still not enough land, but they're still just trying to have to make it work, because Honduras is not allowing people in.
Salvador to Honduras in search of land, and by the 1960s, a huge number of illegal immigrants had crossed over the border from El Salvador. Meanwhile, in Honduras, it's 1963, and this guy has just staged a military coup to prevent the rise of communism, and is now the military leader of the country. He immediately began harassing the peasants' unions and other left-wing groups, but he's a little insecure about the legitimacy of his leadership. So he holds an election and wins, but then the opposing party says, hey man.
So that election was actually rigged, because no one actually liked him, but they still rigged it because he wanted to stay in power.
That election was clearly corrupt and fraudulent, and also you've been bribed by the rich American banana companies who are taking all of our bananas tax-free, and now our economy is in ruins, and everyone started to get mad at him. Now, if you ever find yourself the barely legitimate military leader of a corrupt Central American country, and you start getting into hot water, here's a bit of advice that has been tried and
Start war to distract the people from their misery.
tested throughout the centuries. Blame something else.
Oh.
So he blamed the Salvadoran immigrants for stealing all the land and all the jobs and ruining Honduras. The immigrants found themselves under attack by the hostile locals.
In fact, this wasn't actually too far-fetched, because they were kind of ruining the economy to a certain degree, but not to as much as he was blaming them.
Egged on by the rich American banana companies who wanted all the bananas to themselves, the Honduran government began evicting Salvadoran immigrants who had been living on the land for generations and started sending them back to El Salvador. The Salvadoran elite were furious and protested, citing moral reasons, but in reality, they were just getting a little too crowded.
Yeah.
So tensions were about as high as they could be.
And then you had the World Cup. So in fact, El Salvador and Honduras are quite famous for their love of football, so that is one reason why the war, quote-unquote war, was actually started, but it wasn't really a war.
It's the 1970 World Cup qualifiers, and both countries finished top of their qualifying table, so it was now time for them to play against each other in a series of matches. The first match took place in Honduras. The night before the game, Hondurans gathered outside the Salvadoran team's hotel, making noise and taunting them. The next day, Honduras defeated the exhausted Salvadorans with a late 90th minute goal. After the match, a young Salvadoran fan, unable to bear her country's defeat, shot herself.
Committed suicide.
Disturbingly, the Salvadoran government glorified the incident and made her into a national hero. And
So yeah, she was shown as a martyr for the cause. Now there's a little bit of writing under here. Filler text. This is filler text. Don't need it. Don't read it. I'm going to copy and paste in a second. Okay, here we go again. That's what it says underneath. So it's not even like a real article, which would have been quite good if they actually did that.
Next game, fans brought pictures of her to the stadium. Emotions were running high as the next match took place in El Salvador, and this time the tables returned. The Hondurans had to endure a sleepless night in their hotel, and the next day,
you just have that man. Oh, yeah, so this was actually a dirty white rag that they held up instead of their actual flag, which kind of didn't really put them in a good position.
The match started, instead of the Honduran flag, the Salvadorans raised a dirty rag. So great job at reducing tensions. El Salvador won decisively over the exhausted Hondurans, while spectators battled in the stands.
If we go back there for a minute.
Before the match started, instead of the Honduran flag, the Salvadorans raised a dirty rag. So great job at reducing tensions. El Salvador won
So he says pass the ball,
over the exhausted Hondurans,
but I have no
while
legs,
spectators
that
battled in the
I
stands.
say.
Team
So this
Honduras
was
fled home in a
actually,
bulletproof
so yeah, they had to go home in a bulletproof van because there were riots on the streets because of the loss.
bus with rocks being thrown at them, and the Honduran coach reportedly told his players that they were lucky they lost. In response to the defeat, Hondurans began terrorizing the Salvadoran settlers even more, in some cases reportedly throwing them off their land and burning down their homes, and the immigrants began fleeing back to El Salvador. The final game in Mexico would decide who went to the World Cup. It was close, but El Salvador came out victorious, knocking Honduras
Only
out of
just
the tournament. The atmosphere is riotous, literally, and back in Honduras, attacks on the Salvadoran.
So as well, you also had the fact of there was another riot, and I think they burnt down the Mexico City stadium that it was held at as well. That was how bad it got.
Immigrants further increased. This was too much for El Salvador to bear. With its people under attack and an unmanageable refugee crisis on its hands, El Salvador severed all diplomatic ties with Honduras and declared war.
They declared war, but it wasn't really an actual act
The
of war.
football war is also known as the 100 Hours War, because that's how long it lasted, making it one of the shortest wars in history.
In fact, the shortest war in history was only 38 minutes long. I think it was 1838, and a few British colonies revolted, and we crushed them in 38 minutes.
El Salvador started by carrying out air raids on strategic locations within Honduras, including Toncontin International Airport, which prevented the Honduran Air Force from getting into the sky.
Yes, they did, but then they also didn't, because they didn't bomb it properly for them to stop it completely.
Then, with their superior army, they began an invasion along two major roads, complete with light tanks and infantry. Their advance was rapid, and they were quickly approaching the Honduran capital. Then, the Organization of American States.
So yeah, the Organization of American States kind of put a stop to it. It's like the American version of the UN.
In a bit of a panic, and unanimously agreed that war between El Salvador and Honduras was a bad thing and probably shouldn't continue.
So you have Peru, I think that's Dutch Guyana, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Mexico, and the UAE. That's how it is.
So they went to El Salvador and said, "Can you please stop invading?" And El Salvador declared,
No.
"Not until they stop being jerks." And so the war went on. The Honduran
Actually, the United States actually gave them weapons to help the war.
Air Force finally got into the sky, and with aid from neighboring Nicaragua, they successfully carried out air raids on Salvadoran air bases and oil facilities, crippling the Salvadoran supply line and stopping their advance dead. Caught in a bit of a stalemate, the situation was no longer advantageous to El Salvador. So when the Organization of American States once
then they actually stopped, because there's no point in El Salvador carrying on.
again asked them to stop and agreed to ensure the safety of the Salvadoran immigrants, El Salvador relented, and a ceasefire was organized on the 18th of July. Then the OAS said, "Can you now please withdraw your troops from Honduras?"
No.
No. Please? No. Please? No. Please? No. Do it or we'll sanction you.
Okay, just for you, we'll do it.
You know what? Just for you? I'll do it. So El Salvador pulled its troops out of Honduras on the 2nd of August, and with casualties in the thousands, the war was over.
So yeah, for only a very short war, there was actually very high casualties compared to other wars that are of a similar time.
The economies of both nations were damaged by the war, and El Salvador didn't have the capability to take care of all the returning immigrants, a crisis that eventually helped cause a civil war. The war left behind land and border disputes, some of which are still a cause of tension to this day. El Salvador went on to play in the World Cup, but lost every match they played and didn't make it past the group stage. So in the end, nobody achieved anything, and there were no winners. Except for this guy.
Hence why there's no point. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Like and subscribe, and bye.